Hi everyone, welcome to our next exercise physiology screencast, and today we're going to be looking at altitude. So, a section of the specification, we're going to be looking at knowledge and understanding of preparing for performance at altitude. We'll think about heat and humidity in another lesson, and then thinking about maybe technologies that exist in order to aid that or help an athlete prepare for performance. So, a key question is, how do athletes prepare for a climate different to that of their own country? So we're thinking about what altitude is to start with. Okay, these two diagrams help explain it for you. So we can see here that as the altitude in meters increases, the pressure of the atmospheric pressure, and then particularly focusing on the pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen, decreases. Okay, so obviously the higher we go, the less oxygen is going to be available, and it's shown here in this kind of nice representation on the right hand side. So at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is much higher, or the atmospheric pressure is higher. Okay, and as we get higher in terms of altitude, obviously those oxygen molecules are more sparse, and there's not as much available to us. Okay, and that obviously becomes more significant the higher the altitude. So in terms of how that looks there, so we can see here at sea level, or down at a lower level here, I've got lots of oxygen available to me. Whereas obviously at the top of the mountain here, there's much fewer oxygen molecules, so the partial pressure is lower, there's not as much oxygen available. So the person at sea level will have a certain number of red blood cells, and that's not just for their exercise, that's for their daily living, in order for them to just function normally. And that will be sufficient with the amount of oxygen they have available to them to keep them going, to keep them alive, whether that is in everyday life or during exercise. However, if they move up to altitude where there is less oxygen available, they will have to adapt by producing more red blood cells, okay, so that they can cope with the demands of that environment, okay. And as I said, again, for exercise or just for day-to-day living, in order for their body to carry on functioning, they've adapted by producing these red blood cells. Obviously, then if we brought this person who's been up at altitude, their body is adapted back down to sea level, they're going to have a physiological advantage because they have that higher number of red blood cells and the oxygen available. And I'm going to talk through this in the next few slides, but I just wanted to give you a visual representation to start. So the effects of altitude, and this is my trip down Annapurna Base Camp in Nepal at 4,000 metres, and we really start to feel these effects. Anything above 2,000 metres is considered significant altitude. So the breathed air is at a lower pressure, as we kind of mentioned before. The athletes have to work harder for the same results, whether that's walking, whether that's performing. And the low oxygen pressure is an effect on altitude of altitude, as well. And a word called hypoxia is a key term. So it's when your body doesn't have enough oxygen. Okay, this could be a medical term, but obviously if we're thinking about altitude where your body doesn't have enough oxygen, we can suffer from a hypoxia. So the reduced oxygen in hemoglobin is at 94%. So again, thinking back to our last diagram there, we haven't got as much oxygen available to us. And then there's 4% less oxygen available in the atmosphere, okay? And these effects, will obviously only increase the higher the altitude. So this is from 2,000 meters. Obviously, the higher up we get, the more significant these effects are going to be. So in terms of altitude training then, something that we must have heard of before. So it's based on the principle that with an increase in altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere decreases, as we've said already. The body will produce more red blood cells and increase hemoglobin to cope with the low pressure of oxygen, so as we showed in that diagram earlier. It's used by endurance athletes to increase their ability to carry oxygen. And when we get back down to sea level, the pressure of oxygen increases, but the body can still transport and utilize more oxygen, as we showed with our diagram before, to do with the number of red blood cells and hemoglobin that the body has adapted. And so obviously, as a result, their performance is going to be increased, or the performance level. So the higher the altitude, the more aerobic performance is affected by lack of oxygen. So as we say there, that if you keep going higher, it's going to have more of a significant effect on your body. You'll have to work harder to achieve the same level of performance at sea level. And the degree to which hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen depends on the partial pressure. Okay, so it's just kind of putting into words what we've talked about and what we've looked through in all those diagrams previously. So in terms of gaseous exchange, we can see it here. Another kind of diagram representation. So A is at our sea level there, okay, which is normal, our gaseous exchange, the same amount of red blood cells and hemoglobin. So we can see as we get up to our altitude, we can see that if you look closely, our hemoglobin isn't as saturated, okay, because it's only kind of coloured in half there. And so our body is adapting by producing more red blood cells, okay, which obviously then if we came back down to sea level, we would have a much higher number here, which means that we would be able to carry more oxygen and work more efficiently, obviously in terms of our aerobic activity. So if you want to pause and have a look at this diagram, feel free to do so. So in terms of adaptations, more erythroprotein is produced. You might have heard of this before, which triggers the release of red blood cells. Reduction in plasma volume in the blood and increases the hemoglobin concentration in the blood flowing, therefore increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, okay, as we've mentioned kind of already. So most endurance athletes now do train altitude, and quite a few even live at altitude before returning to sea level, okay? But obviously there are some problems and issues that we can see with this. We can't just spend forever up in the mountains, but as mentioned earlier, there's some kind of technologies that help us replicate this environment down at a sea level. So improved aerobic performance, that's our outcome. Increased hemoglobin concentration, increased muscle myoglobin, so kind of linking back to our aerobic energy system knowledge there, and the same our muscle cell mitochondria, again to do with our oxygen carrying capacity, and then up to 16% more myoglobin in the muscles, improves aerobic athletes' performance and oxygen recovery after exercise as well. Okay, so it's not just about the performance, it's about recovery as well. Just one more quick slide, I think. So endurance-based training, our elite athletes will have a minimum of 2 training blocks. So thinking about our periodization, they'll plan some of their performance here up at altitude. And the short-term symptoms, okay, if we go straight up to altitude, will be maybe, what we call altitude sickness, so dizziness, headaches, increased breathing rate, increased heart rate, which, anything above 2,000 meters, we might start to feel that. So we need to acclimatise gradually. Okay, we can't just go straight up to Mount Everest and try and let our body adapt. And then the return to sea level will have, obviously, an end result of increased VO2 max. So our optimum time to compete would be 2 to 14 days after returning to sea level, after we've made those adaptations to benefit from that performance. So we're thinking about some technologies that exist. So you may have heard of hyperbaric chambers before. So they're low oxygen environments which simulate altitude. Okay, so these big chambers, I think I've got another picture a little bit later on, where they can control the oxygen levels. They can also increase oxygen levels for various medical reasons. But our hyperbaric chambers, in terms of adapting and creating that environment, we can lower the oxygen level to simulate that environment. So it's situated at sea level and it elevates our EPO, our red blood cell levels, myoglobin, mitochondria, and oxidative enzymes, as we said, kind of similar to our altitude training. Then we've got these things called hypoxic tents, okay, and these are kind of a cheaper version of our hyperbaric chambers. They're infused with low oxygen air, and as we can see from the diagram here, athletes will sleep in that tent. So they're spending, maybe 8 hours a night in that environment, and their body's adapting even just in their sleep, okay? Because the more time we spend at altitude, obviously the more our body adapts. It's not just about going for a run up in the mountains. It is about spending a lot of time there for our body to adapt. Okay, so we can see that Mo Farah, he's got a small hypoxic tent over his pillow there. Okay, obviously if his head is in there, then that's absolutely fine. That's going to have the desired effects. And again, that diagram there, where the whole bed is in there, and you can see kind of the ventilator at the side, which is changing those oxygen levels within that environment. Okay, so pros and cons very quickly. So the environment can be manipulated easily. This is our hyperbaric chambers, our hypoxic tents. Athletes can access these close to home or accessible issues fits the athlete's lifestyle, okay, particularly on hypoxic tents. Speeds up recovery, okay, that might be on hyperbaric chambers. We'll talk about them all when we do a recovery next year. Increases the oxygen supply and increases pressure. That's linking to our recovery there, okay, not our altitude training. And then quicker return from injury. Again, we will kind of look at these points a little bit more next year, but that's our benefits of our hyperbaric chambers. And then cons. Cost can be a factor. Okay, not everyone can have a hyperbaric chamber, in their own home. They are very, very expensive pieces of equipment. Only exist kind of in sports hubs and hospitals. And hyperbaric chambers increase atmospheric pressure, which can increase oxygen delivery. And oxygen tents use hypoxic or hyperoxic gases to increase oxygen delivery. Okay, I think those actually should be on the pros slide, but never mind. Okay, but this kind of this changing of the oxygen levels needs monitoring closely, which obviously can be quite difficult to do and time consuming. Okay, so we've had a good look at altitude and how we can use altitude training or simulate those altitude environments. If you need to go back and recap anything, please feel free to do so, and you feel free to have a look at the specification at the start as well.